Hi, I'm Ilan Rubach. I'm at Carnegie Mellon University's Create Lab, and I'm going to show you a quick demo of how to use the Explorable Inequality website that we're just releasing, thanks to the hard work of Chris Bartley and Randy Sargent, also at the Create Lab. Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, really nails down the issue of data and the fact that using data from tax rolls from 100 years back, we can start to understand how inequality has changed around the world over the course of the last century, and we can start to understand the dynamics that will cause changes to inequality going forward into the future. We think the data is fantastic, and it's available online for free. It's called the World Top Incomes Database. That site is challenging to use, and we wanted to create a highly explorable way to look through the exact same data set. So explorable inequality enables you to do that, and I'm going to quickly show you how to use it. So right now I've got it set to top 1% income share, and what will happen if I just start playing it really slowly is starting at 1928 or so, going forward in time, you can see a map of the degree of ownership that the top 1% in each of these countries has of all of that country's wealth in terms of income. That's capital income, like what you get from rent when you rent a house, and it's of course labor income, like the paycheck that you bring home every month. And you can slide it around with your own hand, as you can see. And as you scrub this, what you'll notice is that the entire post-war period, right from late 1940s on, is a period when there was relative equality. That is to say, the 1% richest people, that's like 1.7 million people in the US, had relatively small amount of the overall wealth of the country. You can click on countries and actually bring them up. So I'll bring up France and America and maybe Norway as well, just to show you some graphs. And what's interesting about that, and you can unclick them the same way, by the way, is that as you look at the data, you can start to get a feel for how during this period of time here in the middle, America and France are all similar. We have about 10% of the wealth in the hands of the very top 1%. That's not exactly equitable, but what's interesting is what happens a little bit later. If you look in the 70s, and we know that the 70s is the period of time when the median income per capita in the US started flatlining. That is to say, people started not making more money anymore on average. And in that period of time, the companies started making more money. And as a result, the few people who owned the companies got much richer. So check out what happens to the color of the United States in the 80s when that starts picking up and into the 90s. And by the time you've gotten into the 90s, what's happened is the total wage share of the GDP is dropping rapidly, and instead company profits have a much, much larger share of GDP. So by the time you get to 2000, you've got the internet bubble, which makes us really dark here. So a few rich people get very rich. But even the recession doesn't take much out of that. We get lighter for about a year, and then it picks right up again. And the richest still get rich. And as you can see by the end, America is extremely dark. It's a kind of uncommonly dark. And the top 1% own about 20% of the country at that point. It's kind of interesting to compare that to 10%, because if we look at the top 10%, the top 1%, we have the same flatlining post-war when the world was relatively equitable because a lot of capital had lost its value during the war. But what you'll notice is places like Canada and France actually have more inequality at the 10% level than they do at the 1% level. In fact, going to the future, I'll add Canada to this map. Canada appears to go up just like the US goes up in terms of 10% levels until they get to a certain point that they just don't exceed. The US, of course, the 10% continues upward climb, and the 1% has an even steeper upward climb. What's amazing about the US is that by now, 2013, we have nearly 50% of all the wealth of the country in terms of income is owned by just 10% of the people. Now, to really show off what that means in terms of income disparity, we have two more categories we created with the WTID database. This one's really interesting. What this one does is takes the top 1%'s wealth and the bottom 90%'s wealth and the population size of each of them. And so it graphs for you, for each person in the top 1% on average, how many people in the bottom 90%, that's basically everybody else, how many people in that entire group of everybody else are actually equivalent to their income. So for instance, if you look in the post-war period, it's roughly 12 to 10 people. So everybody in the top 1% makes about as much money as 10 to 12 people in the bottom 90%, virtually everybody else. Bad news is what happens in the 90s as, again, wages and productivity kind of uncouple themselves from company success, is by the time you get to 2012 or so, we have this massive shift where, in fact, each person in the top 1% has something like 33 times as much income as basically everybody else in the bottom 90% of our society. So you can move the slider bar around, you can click on any number of countries and bring the graphs in. You can zoom in and out, of course. This is a Google map. And it's also the case that the URL is changing as you do all this. So you can make any snapshot of any view you want. The URL is your snapshot, and you can mail that to your friends. We hope this is a useful way for you to look at the data, and we hope to add more features to this as the weeks go by. Thank you.